Okay, welcome. This is the second lecture of our Architecture Week, so I'd like to welcome you all, for those of you who are attending the lecture. First, we had a fascinating session with Margarita last night, and as an opening lecture. And this evening, I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Victoria Collis-Buthelezi, who's joining us this evening to give us a talk. And I'm just going to read out to you her bio so we can contextualize her. Victoria is an associate professor in English. She's the director of the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study, University of Johannesburg, and the director for the Center for the Study of Race, Gender and Class, also at UJ. Her research interests include Black intellectual history, as well as Caribbean, African and African American literatures. She's published in several international journals, such as Small Axe, Callaloo and The Black Scholar, in which she co-edited a special issue on Black studies in South Africa. She's series editor of Critical South. She sits on the editorial board of Small Axe. She's a member of the Other Universals Collective, which had an extraordinary event last week at the Forge. It's a consortium of scholars in South Africa, Ghana, Ethiopia, Caribbean, and Lebanon, committed to exploring intellectual histories of exchange across Africa, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and South Asia. Her book, Ends of Empire, Black Liberation, is under contract with Columbia University, eagerly awaited, and Wits Press, and will appear in 2025. The book excavates the print cultures of Black migrants to Cape Town from the Caribbean, the US, West Africa, and other parts of South Africa before the rise of anti-colonial nationalism. Victoria is a research associate at the Institute of Research in African American Studies, the IRAAS, at Columbia University in New York. She's a senior research fellow at JIAS. She was a senior research fellow at JIAS before she became the director. She's on the Global Advisory Board of the Center of Global Black Studies at the University of Miami and the Association of Global Political Thought at Harvard University. She's held posts in English at the University of Cape Town as a senior researcher advisor and at the University of Witwatersrand. So that's quite a prolific profile. Victoria is a part of a community of Caribbean scholars that are doing really extraordinary work. Global scholars, but a number of them centered on work around the Caribbean. And for me, when I hear about a lot of the projects that we are all involved with, and particularly, although not exclusively, those projects that do revolve around Blackness, that revolve around identity, I'm reminded of the work that Victoria does and work that Professor David Scott does, that a lot of work that is taking place in other disciplines that I think we really need to learn from. Sometimes in our work we're articulating ideas around those subjects, but we're not familiar with them, and we can be more familiar with them. And it's the reason why I invited Victoria here this evening to give us some of her reflections coming from her research. And I hope we find some useful and valuable intersections between the work we do and the work she was doing. And I hope it's a relationship that we can continue to build on with the school and the work we do, JIAS and the Center for Race, Gender and Class. So I'd like to introduce Professor Victoria.
Arriving in Cape Town by plane, you might notice the green pockmarks that mar some of its southern suburbs and a little of the city bowl. They are not parks or forests, though they are green. Some appear tiny from the plane, so minuscule that from your airplane window, you might think that they are backyards. Other times, they are quite vast, so big that during a night flight they seem to be gaping holes threatening to swallow you and your fellow passengers. If your plane approaches from the east of Table Mountain, you will see one such green pockmark, Zonnebloem, hugging the mountain's base. Zonnebloem is a white suburb that came to be under apartheid. Before, it was District 6. But it is District 6. District 6 is a multiracial community, the last vestiges of which were razed to the ground in 1982 to shore up apartheid's distinction between white and black spaces. It was the provenance of the colored community, a grouping that includes Khoisan, former enslaved from the Indian Ocean Basin, West Africans, Nguni and Tswana peoples, Saint Helenians, and the descendants of sometimes coercive interracial relationships between white people and people of color. District 6 was also where Afro-Caribbeans lived, some passing as African Americans, whose American second-class citizenship afforded them the status of honorary whites in South Africa. Some of the first removals from District 6 were of natives. In 1902 to Ndabeni, they were removed by the state because colonial medicine tied blackness to disease, and they had become black. Their removal was to clean the city because blackness apparently brought the bubonic plague. To get rid of the plague, the natives had to go, but not too far because who would help do the work of washing, cooking, and gardening, and the docks, and loading and offloading and childminding? Maybe that is where the habit of dipping natives like cattle when they entered the city comes from. They had to be moved out of sight, but stay within reach, for who would do the work? When your plane lands at Cape Town International Airport in the daytime, if you ask to go to District 6, you will eventually pass through some of the places to which the different groups were removed to clean the city, to make the city white. As you wind out of the airport and eventually onto the N2, the freeway splits the Cape Flats. The Cape Flats are the flat, sandy parts of the city below the mountain, caught between the industrial estates and the freeway on one side, and the freeway and False Bay on the other. From the Cape Flats, you can look up the mountain at the former white liberal university and the white suburbs. You are meant to feel the distance between the white suburban enclaves at the big mountain base and the communities on the flats. Cruising along the N2, you can look up the mountain, focus there, and ignore what passes by outside your window. But you can't, can you? To your left, Crossroads, New Crossroads, Nyanga, Guguletu, Heideveld, Welkom, and Athlone. To your right, Bontevale and Langa. The tall, colorful blocks of buildings, the peeps of glittering corrugated iron houses, and the tents. Some of the souls who make home here are deemed indigenous to Cape Town. Others, refugees. That is at least the word that a former mayor used to identify mostly Nguni speakers, Xhosas, from the interior who moved to Cape Town. Refugees. What is it to be a refugee in the country into which you were born? To have your ancestors emptied from a place in which their bones were laid to rest since before the clock. Sometimes, coloreds are considered local, indigenous. Some became colored because their ancestors, the Khoisan, greeted the Dutch East India Company when they landed, helped them avoid death by starvation, fed them, and then were greeted with a fence, blocking them from the coast because the land had been empty before the arrival of the Dutch. You see, for it to not be empty, the Khoisan needed to have buildings of stone and boundary lines recorded in the deeds office. They had to view land as property. Others became colored because the Dutch East India Company started its own trade in flesh from the Indian Ocean Basin, places like Indonesia, India, East Africa, and Madagascar. They belong in Cape Town because these ancestors were incorporated into the VOC's Cape Town as property of some kind. But that kind of belonging, while not white, was also to be movable. What is it to belong in so much as you're movable, fungible? As the N2 climbs away from the flats up the base of the mountain, you will bear right. Fynbos on your left, up along the mountainside, the wind threatening to push your car to the left and to the right. On the right, you will see Table Bay down at the land's edge. Dredged, reclaimed land, like so many colonial ports. Towards the city center, you will go and then down on Rowland Street, away from Vredehuk, up where there's a washing spot that slaves used. All those buildings gone. Those District 6 buildings still alive in some auntie's mind. Bits of broken glass sparkled with the sunlight. This place kept all manner of life, black life, just on the city center's edge. From Cape Quarter across to parts of the city center and deep into the razzed green pockmarked space that refused its renaming. A razzed green pockmark of which people refuse to let go. These places are sites of erasure. They are sites that refuse erasure. They are sites of resistance and remembrance. District 6 holds a memory that is its own, but it is also a memory of the entire city, where the enslaved were held in the Castle of Good Hope, where the African Methodist Episcopal Church had its Bethel Institute in the heart of the city center. At the District 6 Museum, there's a map on the floor where people can write down where they lived. If you go there, you will see memories refusing erasure on the floor. Memory as resistance. For to remember is sometimes to resist. To remember what you are told never happened or asked to forget. To remember differently can slowly shatter what was once held as true. On March 9th, 2015, rumblings that could be periodically heard around South Africa's university campuses since the end of apartheid rose to a fevered pitch and crescendoed with the throwing of human excrement onto the statue of Cecil John Rhodes at the University of Cape Town. The Pooh protest, as it came to be known, was part of a black uprising, a long event known as Fees Must Fall that continued for another 2 years across South African tertiary institutions. This included Rhodes Must Fall, which came before Fees Must Fall, and specifically at UCT, Transform UCT. Several marches and vigils were organized and the main administrative building, Bremner Hall, occupied. It was renamed Azania House by student activists who occupied the premises as part of their standoff with the university administration about Rhodes's statue. On April 9th, the statue was removed from campus and, as if a mirage or bad dream, taken to parts unknown. From the first protest action, many student activists made it clear that the statue signified a larger crisis. A crisis that pointed to the city's racial and racist history, its racialization of space, and complicity in black exploitation. Despite the university's admission of small coteries of black students before the end of apartheid, and its inclusion of even greater numbers of black students since democracy, in 2015, students argued that UCT had not altered the rhythm and nature of learning or knowledge production in higher education. Indeed, the old hierarchies from before the end of apartheid remained. White liberal and progressive universities continued to be understood as research institutions, and historically black universities seen as mostly teaching machines. The disciplinary formations at the heart of the higher education system seemed relatively unchanged. And when change was suggested or implemented, academic freedom and institutional autonomy was said to be under threat. The university's epistemic failure had at least two central aspects: a kind of malaise and a reactionary investment in academic freedom. In many departments across the university, academics who had been employed before the end of apartheid continued to teach the same syllabi that they had developed in the 1980s. In some cases, these syllabi had emerged out of anti-apartheid politics, but sometimes this continuity of late apartheid academic Content reflected a refusal to acknowledge the relationship between epistemology and states of unfreedom. Even those courses that arose out of a left politics did not always answer the challenges of anti-Blackness explicitly, since at their inception, many such courses were meant to challenge white minority rule and help white students recognize Black humanity in order to build mostly white buy-in into a non-racial future. These courses had not been designed for a present in which the majority, either in the classroom or the electorate, was Black. When some teaching staff tried to question curricula, many senior scholars and university administrators did not recognize this as a call to rethink the epistemic structures of the university complex, which are, to use Suren Pillai's wording, the legacy of Bantu studies or Eurocentrism, and part of South Africa's plural inheritance as a settler colony. Senior scholars often saw these pushes for change as threats to academic freedom, institutional autonomy, and standards, while others later drew false equivalencies in a vulgar attempt at oppression Olympics. When they did not identify these as threats to academic freedom and institutional autonomy, they tied the crisis of the South African university complex in terms of the universal problem of neoliberalism and mobilized and championed humanities scholarship in terms of the skills the humanities build, namely critical thinking, rather than in terms of content. While for humanities scholarship, none of these techniques of response attend to the ways in which the South African university complex is entangled in the discursive and literal inheritance of Rhodes and others of his ilk, the beneficiaries and administrators of colonialism and later apartheid. That is, the complicity of the global knowledge economy in the tangle of regimes of oppression. UCT, after all, was built initially to teach colonial civil servants to manage the natives and other buffer races. If Rhodes Must Fall highlighted the epistemic limits of the post-colonial, post-apartheid knowledge order, financially students also pointed to the problem of historical debt. Every year, the carryover of student debt prevents a critical mass of students from moving on to their next year of university. While some can resolve the debt, others are unable to and find themselves forced to leave their studies. Other issues such as safe accommodation, close to campus, transportation, compounded the sense of financial precarity for many Black students of little means or who sat just within the technical borders of the quote-unquote middle class. Taken together, this meant that despite the expansion in university admission, many Black students continued to be excluded financially, in official as well as in more informal ways, and Black epistemologies remained irrelevant to the knowledge economy. So despite more than 50% of their student bodies now being Black, previously white universities such as UCT had yet to acknowledge their institutional complicity in conquest, colonialism, segregation, apartheid, anti-Black racism, or white supremacy. In fact, despite the radical left anti-apartheid credentials of many academics now in university management, the South African university complex was itself, in effect, anti-Black. Even though the majority of students might now be Black, the professional teaching cohort continued to be almost 80%, those numbers have changed a bit now, but not dramatically far, white and aging. To some, this demographic asymmetry was the root cause of the absence of epistemic and financial change, for others the symptom. Either way, it often meant that Black students experienced the South African university as a site of Black pain, historical trauma, and intersections of oppressions, such as racism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and class privilege. In the transition years after apartheid, attempts were made to restructure and recalibrate the university complex. The mergers of historically Black and white universities, such as ours, and the Higher Education Act of 1996 are two key examples of concerted efforts to transform the South African university complex to serve the post-apartheid developmental South African state. These fell under the broad policy of democratizing South Africa called transformation. But if the changes in higher education since 1994 aim to dismantle the system's commitment to the education of white citizens and black subjects, Roads Must Fall and Fees Must Fall argued that the South African university complex needed to be decolonized rather than transformed. The Mafeje and Mamdani affairs, in which black academics with radical pedagogies were pushed out of the university, came back to haunt. What happened here, students asked, and how were their universities constituted? In the weeks and months that followed, students held reading sessions that drew largely on African, Caribbean, and Latin American thought from the 1960s and 1970s, as well as the African American intellectual tradition. In many instances, this work was taught in courses at UCT and elsewhere in the country already. Fanon, for instance, was frequently taught in humanities courses. However, it was often in terms of his critique of neocolonialism and the comprador class, which many saw playing out in South Africa under the Zuma presidency. Thus, the pitfalls of national consciousness was widely taught, but not always on violence or black skin, white mass. Since the 1960s, there had almost always been a contrast between how Fanon is taught in the northern versus the southern hemispheres. In the north, where the prison industrial complex polices the individual black body as itself a violation of law and order, black skin, white mass. In the north, where black people were often a numerical minority, the focus was on Fanon's theorization of whiteness's pathologization of the black body. But in the global south, where blacks were in the numerical majority and had come, in many cases, to hold the reins of political power, and in states that had not always been settler colonies and sometimes could therefore access economic power too, Fanon's thinking on the liberators' failure to extend independence into liberation for all was often the focus. Thus, pedagogy around Fanon focused on the failure, pedagogy around Fanon in the global south often focused on the failure of anti-colonial revolutions to yield nation states that worked for the majority of its citizens. The one focused almost exclusively on identity and self-stylization in the north, the other on ethnicity, class, and political economy. In South Africa, colonialism of a special type and settler colonialism co-constructed a particular form of racial capitalism called apartheid. No wonder students felt at dis-ease with a purely classist analysis and were unable to wholly join the critique of the comprador class. For within that critique, they heard a silence around race and blackness in particular. That silence meant that transformation was doomed to fail, as it predicated its success on the realization of a non-racial South Africa, without undoing the very deeply racial and racist pillars of daily life. Transformation, for all its good intentions, became a byproduct of the South African university complex's neoliberalization. In the wake of apartheid, universities and related institutions had not been, as I've said, restructured or recalibrated. Rather, they were neoliberalized. There were now more black students and more junior black academic staff to teach them, but a radical rethinking of the system, a pedagogy that taught freedom, enacted freedom, and participated in building a new society fit to undo the racial calculus of apartheid and the world system that sustained it. That work had been deferred. In the month between the POO protests and Rhodes's removal, I held my South Africa and the Black Atlantic seminar on the steps where Rhodes's statue once sat. My students and I decided to hold that class session below Rhodes in recognition of the moment/movement in which we found ourselves. For me, the fact that the assigned readings for that week included Alan Kirkland Soga's Pieces in the Colored American, his series of essays called The Black Man to Conference, Ethiopians of the 20th Century, and accompanying photo essays added another layer. Soga was part of the cross-section of global blacks about whom I've now spent well over a decade researching and thinking. At the start of the 20th century, these global blacks saw Cape Town and the Cape as a key site in the making of the black experience and a project of black liberation. Soga and his peers were from South and Southern Africa, the Caribbean, West Africa, and the US, with different, sometimes competing expectations for Cape Town and the Cape, different exigencies driving their turn to this space. I saw theirs as a set of black radical energies that came together at a unique conjuncture in which the end of the transatlantic slave trade and New World plantation slavery handed off the baton to the scramble for Africa, colonial expansion, and extractive mining in Africa, and the turn towards, in South Africa, quote-unquote, retribalization. From 1890 to 1930, when this group of global blacks were most active, South Africa was still in the midst of becoming. But so too were the other mostly colonized spaces that constituted the black world. The post-colonial nation state was not yet an eventuality or even a possibility. These global blacks give us access to a tradition of black radicalism that spoke to both tendencies that emerged after the 1960s. The one that read Fanon in terms of subjectivity and culture narrowly defined, and the other which read Fanon in terms of status practices and comprador class consciousness. 2015 was the third time that I ran South Africa and the Black Atlantic. I thought I was now well versed in taking my 21st century class back to the early 20th century and the unique set of exchanges between Black, South, and Southern Africa, the US, the Caribbean, and West Africa. However, 2015 forced me to put up to stark view in the midst of an unfolding, visceral black radicalism in our present, the version of black radicalism that people like Soga represented. Soga's work was up that week in the same series in which he beseeched blacks from around the globe to convene again as in the 1900 Pan-African Conference. In Call the Black Man to Conference, he venerated Cecil John Rhodes, the man statue whose removal was now galvanizing so many of us in 2015 who in 2015 would identify as black and radical. Soga closed his piece with a mapping of black solidarity, not dissimilar to Rhodes's British imperial fantasy, Cape to Cairo. Soga's clarion call to mobilize across borders against the crisis facing black people around the world at the start of the 20th century, loss of the vote, access to education and land, could easily be one that my class welcomed. But his singling out of Rhodes for praise irked several students, discomfited by the similarity between his words for the mobilization of a global black movement and Rhodes's in the name of the British Empire. Soga spoke of Rhodes with appreciation for the assistance he had given him in gaining employment at the Native Affairs Department. Put simply, as we sat below a feces-stained Rhodes statue, a symbol of imperialism, exploitation, genocide, and incalculable loss, we were faced with the question of just how radical was this early 20th century intellectual and activist, given his publicly proclaimed proximity to Rhodes. What use were he, his ideas, and his investments to us at the conjunction which we found ourselves beneath stone and feces? What of his contemporaries, many wedded as they were to the promise of British imperial liberalism, mired down by settler colonialism, white supremacy, and greed? Soga's reference to Cecil John Rhodes suggests, an intimacy between Black radicalism and British colonialism that is as incongruent as it is uncomfortable and inconvenient to our contemporary sensibilities. Except this intimacy is not new. As Cedric Robinson formulates it in Black Marxism, it was, and I quote, the westernized Black radical intelligentsia that first began the formulation of Black radical theory. We often allied these incongruities in Black radical thought, while other times we quickly label one less authentically radical than the other. Soga might be deemed an Uncle Tom, an Askari, an Impimpi, a house Negro. A Black person unwilling or unable to see the grinding laceration of white supremacy and fight it, often because of the marginal comparative privileges it affords those it favors. The challenge in movement building and theorizing is that infiltration is an effective technology of managing resistance and uprising. At the same time, difference and dissonance within is often too easily reduced to infiltration or inauthenticity. We assume that westernization refers to a set of processes inflicted upon Black people kidnapped from Africa and taken to plantation societies in the Americas. But agro-extraction, in the case of the plantation, was not the only form of westernization. I refuse to paper over the points of difference, to proclaim a single hero, or to deny other geographies of Blackness, precisely because both moves flatten the complexities of Black resistance and radicalism in the face of white supremacy and colonialism. Soga's appreciation for Rhodes was coeval to his calling for a radical convening of Black people from across the globe and with a radical purpose, namely the end of their oppression. In Black Marxism, again, Robinson traces C.L.R. James's trajectory from a Black Victorian to a Black Jacobin. James himself described George Padmore as, and I quote, an old West Indian type, a Victorian type, in an interview conducted by Stuart Hall. Along with Soga, I include them as part of a moment, a now of Black experience. One that the now of that feces-stained statue was reconvening and critiquing, as well as in conversation with. The necessity of grappling with the complexity of Soga's legacy as part of the Black radical tradition was why we had class on the steps below Rhodes. We sat below the statue and engaged Black literary production from and about early 20th century Cape Town in order to determine what it offered Black activists and intellectuals hungry for a site from which to toil for liberation. Rather than emerging solely through Black encounter with white missionaries, the intellectual and literary production around 20th century Cape Town, 20th century South Africa, was also the result of the awakening of a global Black consciousness, connection with Blacks elsewhere, and recognition of different but related struggles against enslavement, conscription, minoritization, and dehumanization. The central thorny question of perceived Black complicity in the imperial project came to the fore, and what we were attempting to do was to understand it. In doing so, I assigned Michelle Roth-Trio and Hayden White's work on history, archives, and the narratives we create through them as discursive expressions of power. I assigned David Scott's work on the temporality of questions and their answers about revolution and radical traditions. In reading the work of thinkers like Soga, as well as teaching it, I've relied on Scott's formulation of the problem space in Conscripts of Modernity. That these texts are emerging, I read these texts as emerging out of a particular, and I quote, context of dispute, of knowledge and power. Problem spaces make demands and condition the possibilities of thought because of the political stakes out of which they emerge. They are temporally constricted and vital for me, geographically shaped. Yet none of us were prepared for the moment that our class discussion had to hold the early 20th century city alongside the stakes of Black liberation in 21st century Cape Town. Black study abroad students wondered how they could join the student movement or if they had a right to do so as non-South Africans. While the Americans struggled with this differently to Africans from elsewhere on the continent, who often felt more acutely than their US counterparts the relationship between indigeneity and Black authenticity. White progressive students endeavored to understand how to ally themselves to the movement. The feces-stained roads reminded us that the business of the 20th century wasn't finished. Despite the century's close, the color line was still one of our central problems. And in South Africa, where racial capitalism flourished through mineral extraction after the long 19th century of emancipation, democracy had brought neither full freedom nor the full end of racial capitalism. Roads Must Fall, I argue, offered a call to desingularize Blackness and to deeply reckon with the geohistorical particularity of different Black consciousnesses. The RMF understood the South African university complex's place and complicity in a global racial order, while holding, at the same time, local particularities in sight. So too did Soga and the global Blacks of his era. I read Roads Must Fall, therefore, as a revisitation of that socio-historical moment of early 20th century Cape Town, where Denise Ferreira da Silva sought to, and I quote, chart the symbolic terrain, the racial shares with the other tools the narratives of history and science have deployed to carve the place of the subject. I reckon with Blackness and anti-Blackness as geohistorical phenomena, experiences and strategies of power and disempowerment by excavating early 20th century Cape Town as a Black metropolis. I believe that in doing so, it does not simply offer a quote-unquote listing of how the racial excludes from universality, but shows that Blackness in one here is not always Blackness over there. So too anti-Blackness here is not necessarily anti-Blackness there. Transfigured spatially, Blackness and anti-Blackness are also altered by time. Blackness itself was intentionally constructed to be local and particular wherever it erupted in the world. By turning to early 20th century Black Cape Town, I am interested in unpacking the forms of racial knowledge and power unleashed upon it, the multiplicity of Blackness, that geohistorical space-time, its particularity, its strategies of resistance and forms of agency, as well as the very theory of Blackness that it afforded. Thus, my aim is to excavate the particular geohistorical context that gave rise to Soga's Black radical thought and the interrelated set of Black experiences at the Cape in the early 20th century, how they have collided, aligned, mixed, or refracted. The early 20th century Cape Town of Afro-Caribbeans, Black Southern Africans, West Africans, Cape Malays, and other non-whites. And this is, I'll come back to this hopefully in Q&A. This is a way of referring to these various groups by one of the conveners of the first Pan-African Conference who moved to Cape Town to start a federation of these groups, who sought freedom there, experienced that port city as a space of encounter between the different epistemologies that constituted their entry into Blackness, that of agro and mineral extraction. Under these two racial capitalist regimes, the Black body is of value to capitalism. But whereas under the first, agro-extraction, the Black body is expropriated and forced into slave labor, the second conscripts the Black body into capitalism through land expropriation and therein cultivating Black demand for wage labor. as Peter Abrams's Mine Boy puts on full display, set in Johannesburg. As the mining industry entrenched itself in South Africa, black people were pushed towards paid labor. Ruma from the north, the novel's protagonist, moves to the city in order to find paid work because there's none in his village, and the land is no longer arable. He wants to work in the mines. The agro-extraction produced blackness via de-indigenization, dispersing millions of captive Yoruba, Ndongo, Igbo, Congo, Ewe, and other groups, forcibly throwing them together in order to break linguistic, social, and political ties. As a regime, agro-extraction removed Africans from their homelands in order to make slaves who would toil intergenerationally for their owners' enrichment without pay. On the other hand, mineral extraction actively retribalized blacks, expropriating ancestral lands in order to render them wage earners. That need for work was cultivated through the establishment of the idea of the quote-unquote native, the tribal as not tied to the land of their labor, but to the land that their work sustains, or the homeland. Black miners become Xhosa, Zulu, Sotho, Shona, Shangaan. While scholars like Sylvia Winter have explored the black experience in the New World as one of becoming new natives, others have revealed the ways in which blacks kidnapped to plantation economies of the Americas were also settlers, sometimes complicit, albeit often conscripted to be so, in the displacement of the indigenous populations that European conquest, expansion, capitalism, and colonial administration wrought. Ultimately, from the door of no return and the slave ship, black slave and free populations of the Americas were meant to lose their ethnicities. Captives were purposely put next to those from other communities and different language groups in order to cut the tongue, quicken immersion in European languages, and prevent the assertion of pre-slave identities and solidarities. Conversely, under mineral extraction, the opposite was the case, as so-called tribal identity was given primacy, while mine housing was laid out to maintain, accentuate ethnic difference, and the homeland in rural areas was elevated as the site of authentic identity. The slave ship did not slice water to take black bodies to early graves in the mining industry. The train, Istimela, cut through land. Again, language refracted black experience. Whereas the plantation used English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French to try to alienate the captive African from their ancestral land, mining, in South Africa at least, used an amalgam of Nguni and other languages to dispossess the black experience from ancestral land. Two different strategies of racial power and terror, each particular but related. I am after, therefore, a fuller account of how they are related, what early 20th century global blacks saw as the intrinsic connections between them, and how they endeavored to give language to these connections and their differences. In claiming a global blackness under the auspices of Cape to Cairo, Soga challenged the very local notion of blackness unfolding in 20th century South Africa, which he was meant to enforce as an employee of the Native Affairs Department. To claim an interrelated black collective from Cape to Cairo was to challenge the definition of blackness instantiated by colonial segregationist South Africa and mining capitalism in the early 20th century. These exceeded their geographies and time. My argument has been that as a field, that is Black Studies, by focusing solely on one space, we have given priority and seniority to one theory or set of theories of blackness, and this has had dire consequences on how we understand blackness globally and dream black liberation. The roads must fall, fees must fall moment was one of many that forced us to contend with these limits in our understanding of the multiplicity of black experience and the making of black radicalism. Reading Soga and his peers is to take seriously that work of excavating what has been silenced and obscured from our line of sight. Such excavation requires grappling with the plurality of roots and roots or routes of contemporary blackness, or blackness in any space-time, and attending to the sedimentations. While Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall took a particular form that I cannot and should not try to disentangle from the making of the South African nation-state, it reveals that we must account for the specific geohistorical context of blackness with an eye toward how they speak to each other. When Western historiography built the myth of whiteness as singular and universal, it claimed Europe as united and Europeans as one singular people, although they had previously understood themselves as racially different from each other. Europeans became one race. The New World different from Old World or continental Africa, Black, sometimes different from African. Black modernity became synonymous with New World slavery, and it became Black theory rather than an instance of it. We need to acknowledge other histories, other roots to Blackness in order to articulate other theories of Blackness. New theory, to follow Cedric Robinson, requires new history. At the start of the 20th century, many activists and students sought to connect across borders, seeing their struggles as interlinked. They exemplify Blackness as solidarity and a deep awareness of the different but interconnected genres of Blackness that different geohistorical moments incurred. All of these before the emergence of the post-colonial nation-state as the primary political form. I've chosen here to ruminate on that which emerged in a mostly Anglophone city, Cape Town, before the post-colonial nation-state, which went on to find itself in a conundrum in Black studies post-1960s, defined by Sylvia Wynter as the ethnic turn. This ethnic turn saw the 1960s Black Studies project reformulated for the study of the US nation-state. Consequently, what is at stake now is undoing this hyper-national notion of Blackness as American and the further limiting of it to the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, and its afterlives. Our conjuncture, as I see it, is one in which race and anti-Black racism are not dead, but much revivified and speaking in new tongues. For too long, anti-Black racism has been understood to have an almost natal tie to numbers. Numerical minority bequeaths particular forms of racial terror, while the numerical majority offers some kind of buffer against anti-Black racism and racialized structural exploitation and extraction. In South Africa, this has resulted in the argument being made that white South Africans are minorities in the way that African Americans, for instance, are. Many parts of the Black world, however, are and have been for some time what I call Black states. That is, the majority of the country is Black or not white. And that demography reflects in the political system. From the vantage point of Black states, it has long been clear that the numbers do not always equal the end of anti-Blackness, as anti-Blackness can come from external forces as well as within. That is, we can live in a white supremacist nation state run by a Black majority. Looking from the post-independence Caribbean, 4 decades after the collapse of the Grenadian Revolution, Aaron Kamagisha formulates it as, and I quote, an amalgam of neocolonialism, post-colonial elite domination, and neoliberalism. This is a critique that university activists in 2015 had been making. This South African example is likely more representative of where the quote-unquote problem of the color line is at our conjuncture than the numbers game. As a result, the emphasis on the nation-state as the instrument through which we must understand race and repair it seems to have hit a limit. As entangled as it has been in the daily function and production of the world system, Blackness has almost always exceeded the bounds of the nation-state. when Njabulo Ndebele used the occasion of the 40th Conference of the African Literature Association in 2014, held here in Johannesburg, to declare an end to his blackness, and in its place claimed a qualified Africanness and an opening to humanness. It was a polemical response to post-apartheid black state corruption and the Marikana massacre. It was the outpouring of a black consciousness activist and writer reckoning with the disillusionment of post-apartheid. Yet it was also reflective of a collective limit to how we understand blackness. The 1960s brought civil rights legislation for black people in the US on one hand, and political decolonization for much of the African continent and black majority states in the Anglophone Caribbean. The 1960s also brought the institutionalization of black studies in the US that often focused on theorizing blackness as a minority experience. Blackness became a numbers game. Barack Obama's election to the US presidency and the rise of post-colonial African and Caribbean migrants to the US has increasingly challenged this paradigm, making us grapple with the fact that if there are more than 40 million ways of being black, there are other geographies of becoming black that do not operate under the same conditions and therefore require new theories to that which has become the dominant. The dominance of a US-centric theory of blackness in part fed Ndebele's claim to be no longer black. Anti-blackness is the work of a white state or a country in which there is a black majority and a white minority. But what if numerical majority was not enough? Cast your gaze outside of the US, and it becomes clearer that numbers are not often powerful vectors of racial transformation. Discursive majoritarianism, not to mention economic power, continues to hold sway. Ndebele's disavowal of blackness does not fully account for the continued commercial and discursive power of whiteness and white supremacy in South Africa. Rather, Ndebele maintains focus on and therein offers a critique of the black-led state elected by the black majority, a refusal of blackness and indeed black liberation if it simply means the freedom of a comprador class to eat. However, I still remember the student who, on reading the line often attributed to Du Bois, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line," who said that it was the clearest articulation of her South African reality in 2015. Of course, that line was not only Du Bois's or only about the American black experience, but it was also, in its moment of articulation, about exploitation in the Congo and anxieties about diamond and gold mining in South Africa, for instance, and what it portended for blacks globally. The nation has never been enough to resolve the incalculable loss wrought by racial terror. The very nature of South African redistribution, or attempts at South African redistribution, shows us this. The term previously disadvantaged not only tells the lie that the disadvantage is only historical and not relived and redistributed in the present, it is also that it is defined in terms of one ability to claim South African indigeneity. But Southern Africa was ravaged by the South African mining complex, and the apartheid state, in its rabid attempts to maintain itself as other neighbors in Southern Africa became independent of colonial overlords. Think again of a scene from Abrams's Mine Boy, in which the protagonist first sees the mine and the queue of workers coming to start their shift. If he and his friend, both boss boys at the mine, are South African, many of those in the queue are not. What is reparations around mining if we only conceive of it in terms of the nation state? Soha's Cape to Cairo may conjure discomfort, but it also makes a call for a global convening of black people and geohistorical instantiations of blackness that reckon with the limits of liberatory and reparative projects that singularize the complex set of relations between blackness and extraction. In many ways, what I am getting at is a history of an idea of what Black liberation could have been, and the loss of early 20th century Cape Town as an avenue for real Black freedom. It was a reckoning and a failed project that promised racial equality and an opportunity for liberation despite its indebtedness to racial capitalism. This period of investment in early 20th century Cape Town as a site for Black liberation was not that of a few. The loss of Cape Town then, as that kind of global Black metropolis, altered the map of the Black world. In the South Atlantic, between the Indian Ocean and the Black Atlantic worlds, shaped by agro and mineral extraction, early 20th century Cape Town sits in the silences. I believe to theorize that space-time and the Blackness of it requires teasing out its plurality. Thank you.